Well, if only King Saul could listen to the teenagers. He would have been a bit more wise, I think, in the decisions that he made. Let's open up our Bibles then, and let's have a look at chapter 18 and verse 7. Because after Goliath had been slain, rather than Saul being thankful that God had chosen a brilliant young man to further his purpose, he becomes all consumed with jealousy. We see this in verse 7 of chapter 18. The women answered one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And that sent Saul into dizzy rage. You know, brothers and sisters, David arguably is one of the finest men that's ever lived. Some may even think that he was the second greatest man after the Lord Jesus Christ. He's certainly in my top 5. And rather than Saul recognizing what a brilliant man he had in his midst, that God had chosen such an extraordinary person to further his purpose, he was consumed with jealousy because he couldn't quite stack up to the qualities of David. Brothers and sisters, human nature, it never changes, does it? It is just absolutely heartbreaking at the beginning of our final talk, our 6th talk, looking at this man. But God is going to be with David because Saul is going to be consumed with envy and jealousy. He just wants to get his hands around the man's neck. He wants to run him through with a javelin. But just notice a few little words that are mentioned throughout chapter 19 now. Notice here how David escaped Saul. It's used 3 times. The end of verse 10 of chapter 19, verse 12, and at the beginning of verse 18. How David escaped King Saul. And the Hebrew there for the word escaped literally means to escape by slipperiness. Okay, and the analogy is a bar of soap. And those of you who have sat in the bath with a bar of soap, you can't quite get your hands around the soap. And that's exactly the same thing with Saul and David. He couldn't quite catch this man, and he's going to hound him. In fact, David is going to describe himself as a partridge in the mountains. For 10 years, Saul chases this man from mountain to mountain, from pillar to post, consumed with envy to destroy this man. Well, David fled. He's hunted like a wild animal. And where is he going to go? Well, we see in verse 18 that he's going to go to Ramah. Let's just read verse 18 together. So David fled and escaped and came to Samuel to Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And you can imagine the disappointment that Samuel would have felt over this man. And he and Samuel went and dwelt into Naioth. Naioth meaning that the dwelling or the tents. It's where the school of the prophets were. This would have encouraged David, and it would have encouraged Samuel, knowing the great prayer that had been committed by his mother, that this could have been potentially the ideal king, that the Lord was going to strengthen the king. And this man now was consumed with jealousy and envy, and was a downright failure in God's sight. News got back to Saul, verse 19, and it was told Saul, saying, Behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. And Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as appointed over them, the Spirit of God was upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. So as we look at these verses here, we're going to see that Saul sends 3 groups of messengers. And every time these groups arrived at Naioth, they had the intention to lay hands upon David here. They couldn't do it. They were overwhelmed with the spiritual environment. And so then Saul decides, I'll do it myself. I'll kill him myself. This is how bad things got, brothers and sisters. Well, verse 23 then. So Saul went thither to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God was upon him now. And he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. You can't believe it, can you? In the following chapter we're going to read that he tries to kill David. This man was so fickle. When he was with spiritual men, he became spiritually minded, but only temporarily. And he stripped off his clothes, we read in verse 24, also, and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all that day and all night. Wherefore they say, in this rhetoric, remember this proverb, like I said, as if pigs will fly, right? This is the idea. It was so improbable that Saul was here amongst the school of the prophets. It was most unexpected. Is Saul also among the prophets? Well, there's a little phrase I want you to notice here, brothers and sisters, because it's very sad, because this idea of him lying down and stripping naked is very similar to the way Abraham spoke to his God. That the language is very similar in the way that God expressed a covenant. And we can see here that this was a man who tried to emulate all the way through his life men and women of faith, but he failed. Now, we need to bear in mind that as he goes here, so where's he going? He's going from Gibeah to Ramah to Naioth. He's going from his home village to the school of the prophets. Now, we've seen that journey before, haven't we? Can you remember? It was right at the beginning of his reign, wasn't it? Remember, he goes through a whole night with Samuel, and Samuel says, I'm going to show you 3 signs. And at the end of those 3 signs, I want you to remember throughout your kingship that God is with you. And he's going to give you a new heart. And I want you, Saul, I want you desperately to be a new man. Can you remember that? And now he's chasing this man, David, a man after God's own heart, with absolute rage and envy. And he goes on the same journey. Can you imagine that, brothers and sisters? He went on that journey with so much hope and expectation that God was with him. And each of those signs were a point of decisioning, weren't they? And we're going to look at these milestones, these little landmarks now, brothers and sisters. I want you to ask yourselves the question, what did Saul do with that particular choice? Well, we remember, don't we? Can we go back to the chapter? It's in chapter 2. We're not going to read the chapter, but as you glance down, we're familiar now with chapter 10 because we spent a bit of time a few days ago in chapter 10. And you can see here that this is after Samuel has spent the night with Saul, and he goes on his way, and he has these 3 signs. And we remember that they are the 3 signs of Gideon. Can you remember that? They're the 3 signs of Gideon. He said, I'm the least of the tribes, the least of the families. He quotes Gideon, and so then, God, through Samuel, says, okay then, I'll act with you, I'll work with you, as God worked with Gideon. I'll give you 3 signs, so that you're assured that God is with you. So first of all then, as you glance down these verses in chapter 10, he's going to go to Rachel's sepulchre. Now, what was important about that? Well, we know, don't we, that Rachel's sepulchre was all about the beginning of the tribe of Benjamin. And that's the tribe that Saul belonged to. And in that tribe, we know how his mother named her son Benoni, the son of sorrows, where his father intervened and said, no, it's the son of my right hand. And so that was the first choice that Saul was going to have in his life. What are you going to be, Saul? Are you going to be a son of sorrow? Are you going to be a king of sorrows? Are you going to bring me sorrow, says God? Or are you going to be a son of my right hand? Are you going to be sat upon the throne of Israel as if you are me, sat upon the throne as my king? So ask yourselves, brothers and sisters, what did Saul do with that choice? How had he made that decision? And then he was going to travel to Bethel. And remember, from Genesis chapter 35, Bethel was associated with the promise that kings shall come from your loins. Kings will come from your loins. And there was Saul, the first king. What had he done with his reign, brothers and sisters? What had he done with his reign? And then the third stop, remember, was the oak of Tabor. Saul, I recognize that you didn't appreciate who was the man of God at Ramah. I understand your past, Saul, but bury it. Bury it under the tree. It doesn't matter. This is a fresh start, Saul. This is your new day of opportunity. What had he done with that, brothers and sisters? So as he makes his way to the school of the prophets and he comes across these 3 signs, they would have powerfully resonated, or should have, within his heart and mind. What had he done? What had he done with his kingship, brothers and sisters? What had he done with his life? And remember that he was going to end up in the school of the prophets at Gibeah. his village, his town, and the school of the prophets had never even met Saul. And the villagers, they couldn't believe that Saul was there. And similarly, he goes to Naioth in the chapter which we're just reading here. And again, he was turned into another man. But there was nothing permanent in that, brothers and sisters, was there? There was nothing permanent in that at all, though God had assured him that he is with him. It was only temporal. And brothers and sisters, if the Lord remains away and we all make our way home safely, what are we going to do with this experience that we've had? And I can tell you, having been to many Bible schools now, this is a very, very special place that you have. And you have very special children, and I'm not just saying that. I believe it, hand on heart. But what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it, brothers and sisters? It's so easy to be spiritual here. What are we going to do? Is this a transition period, a transitory moment, a fleeting moment in our lives, or do we use these experiences to create real permanence in our faith and in our worship to God? We have the choice. We all have the choice. We can either become a son and daughter of sorrow or a son and daughter of God's right hand. Now, we know that after his anointing, he was to be turned into another man. Can we just look at that phrase? Because, as I said to the teenagers here, it's almost as if this kind of depicts his life. Look at this there, verse 6. When you've gone through these signs, Saul, I want you to turn into another man. And I believe he took these words quite literally. So he turns into Gideon. He turns into Joshua. He turns into Abraham. And there's even a chapter of Ruth there. Can you see what he was doing? He was a play actor. He had masks. He had costumes. He had scripted lines. He was on the stage, was Saul, for all to see. But to be like Gideon, you've got to be like Gideon on the inside. Like Joshua, inside. Abraham, inside. Ruth, inside, brothers and sisters. That's the powerful lesson for us. If we want to be recorded in Hebrews chapter 11, we have to be like them on the inside, not the out. And that was the problem with Saul, brothers and sisters. He took these words quite literally, and we've already seen, I think, quite powerfully. Throughout his life, he's quoting all these wonderful characters, and God's placing him in these arenas to kind of emulate and recapture historical moments. And every time it happened, Saul goes through the experience and he presses the reboot button. Are you like that? The reboot. And you start all over again. Saul didn't build on his faith, brothers and sisters. There was a moment and he's back to level 0. That is the example that we have before us, brothers and sisters, and it's incredibly, incredibly sad. We'll come back to 1 Samuel chapter 19 because God's love is with this man all the way through. All the way through. So in 1 Samuel chapter 19, as we've already mentioned there, he's going to strip off, he's going to prostrate himself. As we've got on the screen here, it's the same language of Abraham. So this was a man, if you saw him for those moments, you'd think he was a very good brother in Christ. He's doing something that is of an Abrahamic nature here. But as we know in the following chapter, he's going to pursue David to death. Well, I want to move on to chapter 21 now, brothers and sisters. We're going to just cover the last 10 years of his life. And the reason why we spent so much time in the first part is because it helps us to understand his thinking, his rationale, why he ended up becoming the man that he did, sadly. In the final 10 years, there's very little to learn in many ways because he's raging. He's a madman. And God allows this madman to relentlessly chase his chosen son, David, in order for Saul to wake up one morning and say, "This is madness," and to repent. And David appreciates later on in life that he was really the vehicle for Saul's repentance as he was being chased around from mountain to mountain. At any stage, Saul could have said, "This is crazy." But he didn't. He didn't, brothers and sisters. So in chapter 21 now, we know the accounts. We're not going to dwell too much on the historical episode, but you remember, don't you, that David and his men, he gets to Nob, where the high priest there is Ahimelech. They're hungry, and Ahimelech gives him the showbread. And there's Doeg there. He's an Edomite. And no doubt he was still smarting because a family member had just been made a blooded mess. Remember that? Agag. So he's still smarting over Agag. And he sees David, and he knows David belongs to Samuel. He wants to kill him. Now, we don't know why Doeg was there. He could be purified. He could have had leprosy. He could be becoming a proselyte. We don't know, brothers and sisters. But this is the point. He had an intention to kill this man. And he goes back, doesn't he? He goes back and he informs Saul all that he has seen. So come over to the next chapter. Well, let's remain... Oh, yes, go to chapter 22 and go down to verse 6 there. So you know chapter 21, but when you come to chapter 22 and verse 6, look at these words. When Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having a spear in his hand, and all the servants were standing about him. So whilst this was going on, whilst David there is with Ahimelech in Nob, Saul is there under a tree. And look in your margin, you'll see that it's a grove. There is Saul, surrounding himself in false religion. Brothers and sisters, he was so envious over David. David was Yahweh's hero. I'm going to repeat this because it's really profound. David was Yahweh's hero, and rather than being subject to David and recognize the great qualities that David had, Saul sought other gods so that he could be their hero. Can you see that? Oh, the pride of the man. He was so consumed with David that he turned to other gods. Because he wanted to be number one, brothers and sisters. Being number two was not quite good enough for Saul. He was king. But that still wasn't good enough for Saul, brothers and sisters. Are we like that from time to time? I don't know. Well, Doeg comes and tells Saul what David had received from the hand of Ahimelech. And look at this. It's only a little phrase here, verse 7. "Hear now, ye Benjamites," Saul says. So in other words, Saul has surrounded himself by Benjamites, yes men. He didn't want David, the line of Judah, to come there. Are you like that, brothers and sisters? Just surround yourself by men and women, brothers and sisters, that just accept your point of view? So you can be king and queen of the pack? He didn't have a man of Judah there at all, though the line of Judah had the kingship. We've seen that in Genesis. The prophecy of Jacob. He surrounded himself by yes men. And look at this. It's going to be now a statement that is going to haunt him for the rest of his life. Verse 8. "That all of you have conspired against me, and there is none that showeth me, and that my son hath made me a league with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son has stirred up my servants against me, to lie in wait as they did this day." And then verse 18. "And the king said to Doeg, Turn thou and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned." He didn't need any encouragement, did he? "And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priests, and slew on the day 85 that did wear a linen ephod." Brothers and sisters, what a sad and tragic moment. Now we know that Eli's family was under a curse. So all the priests had to die. But they didn't necessarily have to die this way, and certainly not from the Lord's anointed. It was the Philistines that had killed Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli. It should not have happened this way. And you know, if you reflect upon this for a moment, can you remember Agag? You know the chapter 1 Samuel 15, and he spared that which was good. He wasn't prepared to slay Agag, was he? He brought him into the camp as a trophy. Wouldn't kill Agag. Didn't need any encouragement to kill 85 priests of Yahweh. That's Saul, brothers and sisters. That's Saul. And so, we move on. We move on to chapter 24. I just want to pick out a few points because we're leading to his end, and it's a real climax to the life of Saul, the way that he died. So, David now is fleeing, and Saul is so irrational that he assembles 3,000 men to chase down David. Look at the odds against David there, brothers and sisters. But throughout the life of David, he didn't care about numbers because Yahweh was always with him. And so go down to verse 2 then of chapter 24. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And then verses 3 and 4, and he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and we can see that that is the cave of En-gedi there in verse 1, or as you say in Canada, En-gedi, I hear from the young ones. There he was then in the cave of En-gedi, and Saul goes there not knowing that David remained in the sides of the cave there in verse 3. And the men of David said unto him, Behold the day of which the Lord said unto thee, David, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thy hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirts, or the skirt of Saul's robe privily. So look at this, brothers and sisters. There's an opportunity here. An opportunity presents itself to David to now grab, to snatch the kingdom. He'd already been told that it was his. He'd been anointed. David is only in his early 20s here. And I want you just to look at a little word there in the beginning of verse 7. So David stayed his servants. I want you to look at that word stayed. And as we look at this word stayed, think about it. There was Saul at the height of his powers when he was at Gilgal. Can you remember that? And he starts off with 3,000 men, and it trickles down to 600. And they're running away. They're hiding in caves and thickets. He had no control over them, remember? And so then he feels that he has to offer the burnt offering. Can't wait any longer. Well, in contrast, brothers and sisters, David is a young man. He's in his early 20s, and that word stayed. Have a look. It's used again in Judges 14, verse 6. Just make a note in your margin. Look at it at your own time. And it describes how Samson rent a lion in pieces as if he was renting a baby kid. So there was David, a man after his own heart, and he roared, brothers and sisters. And he brought his troops to control. Can you see that? The leadership of this man in his early 20s. He would have been surrounded by butchers, I would suggest. Hardened men. Soldiers who had been in the heat of the day, who'd seen every experience, seen every scenario, and he stayed his troops. What a wonderful man. A man who can write the Psalms, a man who can dance before his God, and he can stay his troops. And he would not. This was the Lord's anointed. And so then he cut off the skirt of the garment privily. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a bit of a play on words here. First of all, he cut off the garment. And we know, if you look at 1 Samuel 15 and verse 28, after the incident of Agag and the Amalekites, where Samuel says to Saul that he was now going to turn his back. He had rejected Saul. His kingdom would be stripped away. And you can remember what Saul does. He holds on to the hem of Samuel's garment and he tears it. And in that episode, Samuel had told Saul, I'm going to give it to a neighbour. He's a Benjamite. The neighbour has to come from the tribe of Judah. And so then, by cutting away the hem of Saul's garment, he is now telling him in a very polite way, I'm the neighbour. Can you see that? I'm the neighbour, and I've spared you, Saul. Though God had already selected me, I have spared you. I'm a man of mercy. Isn't that wonderful, brothers and sisters? And this whole appreciation is picked up when you come to verses 10 to 15. And we're not going to read them here. But just glance down, in the interest of time, just glance down verses 10 to 15. And here, when Saul wakes up and he recognises what David has done, you've got this lovely statement from David. And in all of this, brothers and sisters, that there's a real humble man recognising that Saul was the Lord's anointed. It's wonderful. He could have really gloated in that moment in time, couldn't he? He'd been hounded for 10 years. A javelin had missed his head. He tried to get his hands around David's neck. And this was now David's final moment. And look at that set of words there from verses 10 to 15, brothers and sisters. Would you have responded like that? No wonder he was a man after God's own heart. And this is God's heart, and brothers and sisters. And verses 10 to 15 gives us a lot of hope, doesn't it, for the judgment seat? A lot of hope for the judgment seat. It is God's good pleasure to give us the kingdom. Verses 10 to 15 describes a man who'd been hounded by a tyrant, and he just shows love, mercy, and respect. Quite wonderful. But I want to focus on some of the words here that Saul says, because finally now he recognises that David was a better man than himself, that David was the true deliverer, that he was the true Joshua. Finally now Saul begins to appreciate, to be like Joshua, you've got to be like Joshua on the inside. Finally, the penny has dropped. So let's just pick up then these words of Saul. Verse 16, and it came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, such gracious words, brothers and sisters, read these words in your own time, beautiful, that Saul said, is this thy voice, my son David? Only he'd behaved like that throughout his life. And Saul lifted up his voice and he wept. And he said to David, thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I've rewarded thee evil. Thou hast showed me, finally, the scales have fallen off his eyes. Thou hast shown me this day how thou hast dealt well with me, forasmuch as when the Lord hath delivered me into thine hand, thou killest me not. You've just shown me that you are the neighbour, that you are God's appointed king, king in waiting, king elect. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee, David. Reward thee good for that thou hast done unto me this day. And now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, finally. And that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hands. Swear now, therefore, unto me by the Lord, that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name after my father's house. And this was really the problem of Saul. It was all about appearances. His legacy. Forget about legacy. We don't care about legacy, brothers and sisters. All we care about is being in God's kingdom. Even if we're just a doorkeeper like the Psalms of Korah, it doesn't matter, does it? We just want to be there. That's all we want to be. We want to be in God's kingdom. Now look at this. The word cut off there, that thou shalt cut off. As we've got on the screen there, karath, the idea of cutting a covenant, is the same word that you find at the end of verse 4. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. So he picks up this word here, a description of what David had done to him, and he recognises in that act that this man had a right to destroy him. Because we're going to see in a moment that Samuel, with the witch of Endor, says that you are an enemy of God. But he doesn't. He shows him love and mercy, brothers and sisters. He shows him the kind of king that he should have been. And so then we see in verse 22, and David sware unto Saul. What a wonderful character we have here. And Saul went home, but David and his men get them unto the hold. And how significant it is that after this moment we read in chapter 25 that Samuel died. Perhaps now with a feeling of contentment. He had seen, can you imagine, brothers and sisters, a man that he had anointed, seeing him chasing David around the city, around the country. Can you imagine what that would have done? It would have been soul-destroying to Samuel. Knowing what had happened to his own 2 lads, where he places them at Beersheba. It was almost a repeat of Eli, wasn't it, with Samuel, brothers and sisters? Broken-hearted. But now, in chapter 25, there's a glimpse, a ray of hope. A ray of hope. That now, finally, this mad, insane tyrant recognized that David should be king. And brothers and sisters, there's no disgrace in failure. I want you to remember that there is still an opportunity for Saul to seek redemption. And I'm going to show you this. God wants to save Saul. He doesn't care about Saul being king. That has long gone. But God is working in this man's life because he's saying, Saul, you'll never be king in Israel. It's going to be David. I've stripped it away. But I want you in my kingdom. And that's how God works with us, brothers and sisters. He's going to work with us if we allow him tirelessly to the last breath. The last breath that we have. But we've got to let him. We've got to let him, brothers and sisters. And so we're going to see here, perhaps there's another opportunity for Saul. Let's just go on then, verse 1. And Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together, and lamented him, and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. But as you go down these chapters, and we come now to chapter 28, I know we're skipping a little forward in time, but it all carries the same theme. Is Saul still lost, brothers and sisters? Well, he is. In chapter 28 then, we read here in verse 4, and the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. Now, why is that significant? I want to ask you that question because we've emphasized certain things this week. Why, brothers and sisters, when you see verse 4, why is that significant? This is now going to be Saul's last opportunity. Look at it. Why? Don't need to shout out, but just think. Have you got an answer when we read verse 4 together? Well, as the teenagers told me, Uncle Stephen, it is significant that it's the Philistines again, because the king had been anointed to defeat the Philistines. So what's God doing? You failed. You failed with the Philistines, but I'm going to give you one last chance. Do something good for me, Saul. Do something in faith. But the other thing, brothers and sisters, where is it? Where's he going to fight the Philistines? At Mount Gilboa. Why is that significant? Anyone? Who fought his greatest battle at Mount Gilboa? Gideon. Gideon, brothers and sisters. He gives Saul one last opportunity. I'm going to redeem you, Saul. I'm going to try my very hardest. You're up against the Philistines. That's the role of the king. That's the criterion. That's the reason why you were anointed. And you love Gideon. Remember the 3 signs. You've lived out that life of Gideon. Well, we're going to play it again. One last throw of the dice. Have a look in Judges 6 and 7, brothers and sisters. Let me just show you so that you've got it in your margin. Judges chapter 7. Those of you who've been to the land will recognise the picture on the screen. Just so that you've got it. Judges chapter 7. Look at this. It's wonderful how the scriptures just dovetail together. Chapter 6 is all about the 3 signs that God says to Gideon, I'm with you. And chapter 7 is all about the Midianites. Remember that? The sand upon the seashore in multitude. We've seen all that. Well, look at this. In verse 1 of chapter 7, where the battle is going to take place, then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Harod, so that the hosts of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. That's all we're going to go to. And look at the screen there. The well of Harod, or Ein Harod there, is at the base of Mount Gilboa. He's in the same place. Be like Gideon one last time. Brothers and sisters, if you ever want to be reminded of God's mercy, think about the life of King Saul. Right at the end, he's been in a grove. He's tried to kill God's elect for 10 years. He's about to go to the witch of Endor. You couldn't do worse things in your life, really. You couldn't. He's still there. Right there with this man. Till the end. So, what's Saul going to do with this opportunity? Can he see it? This is a man who knew his Sunday school stories. He knew where he was. Could he muster up the courage one more time? That's the tragedy, brothers and sisters, because at night, as we know, rather than being like Gideon, he goes to see the witch of Endor. Under disguise at night, forbidden under the law, he now becomes a villain of God. Rather than appreciated the scene, the setting, the arena where he was, God's hand of providence, he goes to see a witch, to summon up words of Samuel. And he knew what Samuel would say. Guilty. But Samuel was the only man that ever spoke truthful words to this man. And he knew he would be hit by the truth. So he wanted to speak to Samuel, brothers and sisters. It is absolutely tragic. So he goes under the cover of night. Verse 11. Then said the woman, whom shall I bring upon thee? There's no mistake in Saul's mind. Bring me up Samuel. And it's going to be the words, guilty. Now, I don't know what you think about this account. Some believe that this section is fake. I don't agree with that at all. Some would say, look at verse 14, for example, the phrase, an old man cometh up and is covered with a mantle. It's so vague that the witch didn't see it at all. Well, think about these two things, brothers and sisters. First of all, the word mantle is the very specific mantle. It is the prophetic mantle. And secondly, a prediction is going to be given that Saul and his sons were going to die in the morning. The witch wasn't saying these words to curry favour with Saul. It was a message of doom, brothers and sisters. And when the scriptures emphasize to me, bring me up Samuel in verse 14, verse 15, and Samuel said, and verse 16, then said Samuel, verse 20, the words of Samuel, these words were real to Saul. And so whether Samuel was reconstituted or whether it was a vision, brothers and sisters, in my mind it is a very similar vision, or a reenactment of life upon the Mount of Transfiguration where Moses and Elijah, whether they were real or whether they were in vision. You have your view, I have mine. But in the mind of Jesus, they were real. And they spoke of his exodus. And these words were real. And the finger was pointed. And he was pronounced guilty, brothers and sisters. But verse 16 says, then said Samuel, wherefore then didst thou ask of me, seeing the Lord is departed, Yahweh is departed from thee, and is become thine enemy. Now, brothers and sisters, let's notice that, has become thine enemy. Can you see that? There's a difference there. Yahweh, in the mind of Samuel, here, as he said these words, Yahweh was Saul's enemy. But it wasn't the other way round, was it? Yahweh was not treating Saul as an enemy. Can you see that, brothers and sisters? It's a really important point. In the mind of Saul, Yahweh was his enemy, but in the mind of God, Saul was someone he was trying to save. Well, we know, as we go down these verses here, that just as the witch of Endor said, these words came to pass. Every word. Jonathan and his brothers die. This wonderful man of love. A man, as Brother Ken said during the week to me, he said, you know, Stephen, God's love was seen in Jonathan. And it's a lovely point that Brother Ken made. Seen in Jonathan. That was the figure of his love for Saul as he looked upon his son. And I agree with that. It's a wonderful idea that Brother Ken shared with me. A lovely idea. But Saul here, he loses his boys and he's shot. And he wants to be killed, doesn't he? And he throws himself upon his sword. Come to chapter 31. We're just going to pick out a few ideas here, brothers and sisters. So you can see in verse 1 now, the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down and slain in Mount Gilboa. Think about Judges 6 and 7, what could have been. This man was all about what could have been. And then the Philistines, they slew Jonathan and his brothers there, Saul's sons, in verse 2. And then verse 3, and the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. And then look at these words here in verse 4. Then said Saul unto his armour-bearer, draw thy sword and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised... Isn't that interesting? He uses a term of Abraham, just like Jonathan had done, just like David had done on the battlefield against Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And now, once again, misappropriately, Saul uses it. A quotation that he's heard elsewhere. He's still trying to be someone else that he's not. Through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armour-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. Now, brothers and sisters, this was an opportunity for God to redeem Saul. He was up, as it were, against the Midianites again. As God's hand was with Gideon, God's hand was with Saul one last time. And remember the prayer of Hannah. Can you remember that? At the end, in verse 10 of 1 Samuel 2, can you remember what it says? The Lord shall give strength to the king. And throughout Saul's life, he never believed that, brothers and sisters. He never believed that God was with him. He never believed that God would give him strength on the battlefield. And so, in this opportunity for God to redeem this man just before he dies, God has an opportunity, this last fleeting moment, he has an opportunity to save this man. He commits suicide, brothers and sisters. Who does that remind you of? Judas. Yeah, Judas. Redemption was still there for Judas because it was fulfilling what the scriptures said. Though he had a hand in the bag, and though he betrayed his Lord with a kiss, he could still not believe that God could provide forgiveness and redemption. So he took his life. And that's the saddest thing, brothers and sisters. A blasphemy in the spirit of the Spirit where we come across. For me, what it means is someone who believes that God doesn't have the power to save. He denies God's power. So we become like Saul if we deny his power in our lives, if we stand alone. Saul started, didn't he, his reign by hiding behind the stuff alone. And brothers and sisters, that was almost a figure of his entire reign. He was always hiding behind the stuff. Always allowing others to do the work. Never standing upon the battlefield. Never putting on the whole armour of God. Never praying that 7th item of prayer of Ephesians chapter 4. He never did any of that. What are you going to do with your life, brothers and sisters? How are you going to fight? Are you going to deny God's power in your life? Well, chapter 31, we're still there. Look at these words here in verse 8. And it came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa, and they cut off his head. David had done that with Goliath, hadn't he? As a figure of Genesis 3, verse 15. You know what that tells me, brothers and sisters? He was an enemy of God. He had become an enemy of God. God could not save him because he didn't allow God to save him. And his head was full of serpent thinking. Full of serpent thinking. And it had to be cut off. That's the tragedy, brothers and sisters. And cut off his head and stripped off his armour and went into the land of the Philistines round about to publish it in the house of their idols and amongst their people. And they put his armour in the house of Ashtaroth. the goddess of fertility. You can imagine the kind of things that were going on. He was placed in the house of harlotry. Remember how Ahab died in the chariot? His blood mingled with the harlots. Remember that? Very similar, isn't it? And they put his armour in the house of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. The word Bethshan means the house of rest. And that's where his life was now going to finally rest, in a place of false worship. And that's how he was going to end. And his armour was going to be placed in the temple of Ashtaroth as a memorial to all the nations around of what happens to an enemy of God. But there was a reprieve, wasn't there? Saul had done one good thing in his reign. Can you remember that? It was in his first year. If you blinked, you'd miss it. It was against Jabesh Gilead. Can you remember that? And it was motivated for a reason. Judges 20 and 21, remember that? With the Levite and the concubine, and how the sons of Benjamin abused that woman. And so a call went out to all Israel, and all the tribes came except Jabesh Gilead. And so then every tribe, or every member of the tribe of Benjamin, would appreciate the mercy that Jabesh Gilead showed to the Benjamites. And it was there, at the beginning of his reign, that Saul fought against Jabesh Gilead, or fought for Jabesh Gilead against the Ammonites. Can you remember that? And all the way through the reign of King Saul, the tribe of Jabesh Gilead was deeply appreciative of what Saul had done. And so, you know what they do? They send men, and they bring the body of Saul back. If he hadn't have done that, he would have ended up in the temple of Ashtaroth. And they bring him back, and he's buried at home. Let's just pick up verses 11 and 12. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which was the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. And it's lovely, you know, because when you think about how Saul fought, how he fought for Jabesh Gilead. Can you remember? He assembled 3 groups, didn't he? He fought like Gideon. He fought like Gideon of Judges 6 and 7. This was the height of his reign when he really was Gideon. And being like Gideon, retrieved this evil situation where his body would have been buried in the house of false worship. And so, brothers and sisters, as we start to think about concluding here, let's just go to 2 Samuel here. And David now is going to be informed that Saul and Jonathan, a man that his heart was knit to, and his brothers were dead. Let's look at these words here. Would there be any gloating of David here? Verse 19. He composes these words. And in these words, brothers and sisters, he appreciates, doesn't he, that Saul was hounding him for a reason. The Apostle Paul, in all his writings, he talks about saving your brother. And here's the sentiment of Paul, isn't it? Because now David appreciates that he was being hounded in order that his brother could be saved. He sees his situation as the handiness of God. Do we, brothers and sisters? Do we, in our distress, in our calamity, when we fall, do we see that it's God's hand working within our lives to bring about our redemption? Look at these words that were composed. The beauty of Israel, says David, is slain upon thy high places. The beauty of Israel. He's not only talking about Jonathan, he's talking about Saul here. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Let the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no Jew. It's talking about here metaphorical language. I don't want any rejoicing even in the mountains. Let there be deprived of joy. Neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For There, the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away, the shield of Saul as though he had not been anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, they were lovely and pleasant. Can you believe these words, brothers and sisters? Were these words written in a spirit of mockery? No, of course. They were written under inspiration. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Brothers and sisters, I find these words very moving. This is the man David, brothers and sisters. How he refers to these two men as sweet, and tell it not to Gath. It's a hymn all about what could have been. What could have been, brothers and sisters? He could have defeated the Philistines. He could have destroyed the Amalekites. Exodus chapter 17. That curse of the Amalekites. He could have been Gideon. He could have been Joshua. He could have been Abraham. He could have had the faith of Ruth. What could have been, brothers and sisters? What could have been? The Lord's anointed. And we have a choice in our own lives, brothers and sisters. And it's a very common phrase that we use, isn't it? What if? What if? There's no what ifs, brothers and sisters. It's today, and that's our opportunity. What are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it? And just as God had placed Saul in all these arenas, he's doing the very same with us. And often, isn't it? And I'm sure when we reflect upon our lives and we look at circumstances and we think, we've seen this before, this is a bit of deja vu. Of course, that's the way that God works with us, so that we learn. And we do it right the second time, or the third time, or the fourth time, or if it's me, the 10th time. Right? So that we learn, brothers and sisters. This is the way that God worked with Saul. This is the way that God works with us all. So then, we think of Hannah. That's where we began. This wonderful prayer. A prayer for a priest and a king, that they would work together. That they would work together, that God would give strength to the king, and the priests would work together. Though it was a land that had no king in Israel, everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. These two men could bring about a redemption in Israel. And finally, God had got his man in David. And Samuel had prepared this man to be king. But for Saul, he'd taken that phrase to be another man quite literally, hadn't he, brothers and sisters? Throughout his life he had play acted. He was always on stage. He was emulating Bible characters, but not their inner parts, wasn't he? Every scene he was thinking about trying to show that he's a deliverer, that he's a saviour, that he was better than what he really was. He was consumed with other people's opinion rather than pleasing God. That can be something that happens in ecclesial life, that we just become too interested in what other people think of us. We all suffer with that from time to time. I love to see a brother or a sister who doesn't care about it. I love to see it. I often think, I wish I could be a bit more like that. When they know what they're doing is right, and they do it. As Brother Thomas says, don't care. You remember? Don't care a rush. If only we could emulate a bit of that spirit, brothers and sisters. Those words that were passed down to Samuel, when the 7 boys of Jesse passed by, Samuel, you've got to learn something. I don't care about the stature. I don't care about the countenance. I don't care about the outer man. I look upon the heart. And David, when he was finally anointed, he was at Samuel, what did you learn? What did you learn in Bethlehem? David, don't care about the outer appearance. Just care about the heart. And as we've seen in chapter 17, when he's there against Goliath, this great man, this man of stature, he says, you uncircumcised. He knew. He knew, brothers and sisters. And so we'll leave it there. There was Saul, a man who never allowed God into his heart, a man who began his reign, as we said, hiding behind the stuff, became consumed with the stuff, became consumed with other people's opinion, became consumed with the trappings of this life, brothers and sisters, and didn't want to lose it. And throughout his life never allowed God to enter into his heart, to transform him so that he could truly become like God. And he began his reign alone, hiding behind the stuff, and we've seen, sadly, at the end of 1 Samuel, he dies alone, about to be placed in the temple, and he's brought back, brothers and sisters. And so that's a tragedy, isn't it? But it's not a tragedy, because these are all great learnings. As the curtain was being drawn upon the stage, because there was Saul, he'd acted out all these characters, and there was nothing left. His lines were up. There were no more masks to place on. All the costumes had been used. His time had come. But there was a man in the wings. It's about to come onto the stage of Israel's life. David. A man after God's own heart. The promises were going to flow through this man. A man that allowed God to enter into his heart. And by entering into his heart, he was able to transform the nation of Israel. And we give God, don't we, thanks for that moment, don't we, brothers and sisters? The ideal king. And so that's where we're going to finish this week. In all this silliness of Saul, God was preparing slowly, quietly, as Brother John was saying to the kids last night, little by little, he was preparing David, the ideal king, who was going to allow God to strengthen him. And finally, the fulfillment of Hannah's prayer was going to bear upon the nation.